back to back today. I'm here with my friend, much respected genius, researcher, professor of psychedelics, and many other things. A brilliant man of knowledge, not just of, um, your knowledge, brother, is like vast and immense. And I'd love to have a share and go into different realms of that. Everything from spirituality to comparative religions and consciousness, all the way to psychedelics and history and the science behind all of that. And you're also an acclaimed author, and you've been on many interviews, and you've taken people, you've supported people in different forms of journeys, medicine journeys. And so I'm so honored to have Martin Ball here with us here today with Warrior Sage, our family. So thanks, brother.
It's a great pleasure to be here. I'm really glad that we're not experiencing gale force winds and wildfires and internet shutdowns today. So everything's working correctly.
Well, listen, I just wanted to dive right in with you because, I could go on for hours. Every time I chat with you, I love the different wormholes we go into, but I'd like to just first start off with, we're in the most interesting times, crazy times in our life, right? Tell us what you've experienced. How are you receiving this? What does this mean to you from your experience?
Oh my goodness. Well, there's so much going on. So it, how I would answer that would really come down to what aspect of the current reality that we're really talking about. I'll start with one thing that maybe is a bit more universal for people. So you've already mentioned, my work with psychedelic medicines and excuse me. So just something that came up for me, this was, actually, I'll share two stories with you, okay?
Please do.
So this was before the 2016 election, and I was experiencing MDMA and I believe also either 4-ACO DMT or psilocybin mushrooms simultaneously. I'm a big fan of cocktails. I enjoy mixing different medicines together and the different presentations. Anyway, 4-ACO DMT basically turns into psilocin once it gets inside your body. Excuse me. So it's fairly identical to psilocybin mushrooms. So I don't remember exactly what I was enjoying at that time. But anyway, I'm lying down on my bed,
Yes.
listening to music. I have my eyes closed. And for me, the fundamental nature of reality is one universal self that is unconditionally in love with itself. That the only thing that exists is this universal self that is interacting with itself across every level imaginable simultaneously. And because the only thing that exists is the universal self, it has unconditional love for all aspects of itself. So there's no judgment, there's no preference, there's no playing favorites. It is just, it's raw, sometimes brutal, sometimes I would say ruthless, unconditional love. So anyway, I'm lying there, eyes are closed, and I'm experiencing unconditional love. And in this visionary state, there's this long line of people. From my perspective, everything is perfectly black. And there's a long line of people, and I can see this line just stretching on and on and on. And in this line, there are all different kinds of people, and it's all incredibly realistic. So there's nothing psychedelic going on. And there's men, women, children, elders, people of different races, ethnicities, every different kind of person imaginable. And each person comes forward, and in this visionary state, I give them a hug. And between us, we experience a moment of just absolute unconditional love. I don't know who you are, but I recognize that the self that is you is also the self that is me, and I love you without question. So this goes on for a while, and there's no problem. It's all great. Then the next person in line, it's Hillary Clinton. And I don't have any particular feelings around Hillary Clinton. Absolutely, I would have preferred her to be president to Donald Trump, without question. But it's not that I'm a Hillary fan, but I'm also not one of those anti-Hillary people in any way. But she's there and she's wearing, one of her pantsuits, and I'm very surprised, like, wow, it's Hillary Clinton. And so I end up giving her a hug, and it was nice. But then, by God, the next person in line, it's Donald Trump. And he's there, that kind of smirk he gets on his face, and he's and my immediate personal reaction is just disbelief and revulsion. It's like, oh my God, it's Donald Trump. But what we're doing here is we are exchanging unconditional love. So Donald Trump comes forward, give him a hug, I love you, and then that whole visionary scene just evaporated. That was the end of that. And so in a sense, that's kind of where I'm coming from, that I always like to make distinctions between, yes, we are one universal self that has ruthless, uncompromising, unconditional love for all aspects of itself. But that does not in any way negate or override our individual experience of being, that we are still responsible for our own likes and dislikes, our own preferences, and that universal unconditional love is different from taking responsibility for our own personal perspective and our own personal well-being. And that finding the balance between those two is really, in some ways, that's sort of the universal human quest of how do I embody myself as both the universal consciousness that is everyone and everything, but also respecting the fact that I am also an individual. So from the universal perspective, nothing really matters. Yet from the individual perspective, it does matter if I walk out into traffic and get hit by a semi. It's going to matter a whole lot to me personally as an individual. And that we're kind of living through multiple levels of crisis that both calls forth the need for universal love and recognition that we really are all one. And also individually recognizing that that doesn't mean that everything is okay. It doesn't, in the largest sense it does, but in the individual sense, like for example, yes, we're all one. We are all fundamentally equal. But currently in the United States, if you are a person of color, you are a target by the police. And so that therefore Black Lives Matter as a protest movement is incredibly significant, right? So that we can't just say, well, oh, we're all one, so what does it matter if you're black, white, yellow, green, purple, whatever color you are? Well, the reality of our social system is that the color of our skin does matter, and that we need to address that so that we can then come from a place of universal love and universal acceptance and universal equality. But first, we do need to deal with the reality of our individuated existence. So that actually wasn't the story that I wanted to tell.
It's like this eternal battle between everything matters and nothing matters.
Yes.
All matters right now, and at the same time, simultaneously, nothing matters. When one is touching a transcendental knowingness, right,
Yes.
from our beyondness of this form. But if some of us lean really into nothing matters, and it would be supportive if they mattered more. And there's some of us who are like so in matter of it that we're so inflamed that we're actually not actually adding beneficially to whatever expansion is behind the intent.
Yeah.
And so we got to make it not matter as a bit to calm ourselves down. So it's like that essence of the eternal Tao now of it.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah. Yeah. It's one of these fundamental paradoxes of being. And just as you say, some people slip one way or the other. And this is one of my big critiques of a lot of religious and spiritual systems, that many of them seem to slip all the way into, well, none of it matters, so I'm just going to sit in meditation for the next 40 years and just let society do whatever it wants. And that kind of slips into sort of a spiritual nihilism. And then the other side is, I am so immensely invested in all my problems, and they're my problems, and they're mine, and they're me, that the fundamental paradox of being is that both of these things are true. And so finding, maybe to use Buddhist language, finding the middle path of where can I embrace both my universal self and my individuated sense of self, and then come from a place of genuine authenticity so that I can embody myself and both respect the fact that nothing matters and actually everything also matters to me at the same time. So finding that balance, that for me is the ultimate quest, and being able to embrace the paradox of being. I mean, just the fundamental paradox that we are all simultaneously the universal self, the universal consciousness, where I just like to use the word God because it's easy. We are all God, but we are also still the individuals that we are as well. And what happens to us as individuals matters to us as individuals. Might not matter to God as God. Because, one of the ways that I put this into language is that reality is filled with billions of characters, but there's only one actor that is playing all of these characters simultaneously. So from the character perspective, if we want to get to the end of the movie, really, I want my character to be the hero. I want to survive. I want to be successful. I don't want to be killed off early in the movie, right? But see, if you have one actor who's playing all the parts, then that one actor is like, well, if my character get killed off early, I want to make sure that it's really dramatic and it's a lot of fun, and that it has a lot of drama in it. But if you are that character, then you feel like, oh, well, why has this happened to me? We take it personally. And so it's kind of riding this fine line between take it personally, but don't take it too personally, be unconditional, but also respect, as an individual, we have to respect our own boundaries. We do have to respect our own likes, our own dislikes, and that sometimes we get too attached to those. So this brings me to the second story, and actually the one that first came to mind about all what's going on here. So shortly then after Trump was elected president, I was in another visionary.
You hugged him in your journey.
Yeah, so this is after I gave him the hug. Then he got elected.
Yes.
And then it was another cocktail night, which with MDMA mixed with 4-ACO DMT, and I think at this point I had added in some MXE, which is a methoxylated ketamine. So anyway, again, I'm lying down, I'm on my bed, my eyes are closed, I've got my headphones on, I'm listening to music, and suddenly this scene opens up, completely realistic. I've never been to New York City, but I got the impression that I was standing on top of a skyscraper looking out over New York City. And I can see all these high rises, all these big buildings. And I'm just up there just kind of taking in the view. And I'm like, wow, this is interesting. Here I am. And then I hear all this noise behind me. And so I turn around to see, well, what is all this noise? And this was shocking. There are 6 different versions of Trump. And each one of them has like power tools and hammers, and they're just hammering away at the top of this building, at the top of this skyscraper. And they're just pounding on it, and there's all this noise. And I'm like, this is bizarre. There's 6 of them, what's going on here? And then one of them looks at me and says, oh yeah, I know there's a lot of noise, but don't mind the dust and the noise. Said, you should see the renovations that are happening on the back end. And then at that point, the whole visionary experience flipped, where suddenly, the best I could put it is I'm backstage. I'm no longer on the front side of reality. I'm now on the back side of reality. And it was just these torrents of information, just endless streams of information. And in those streams of information, I can hear the voices of every person existing on the planet. I can hear their thoughts, I can hear their conversations, I can hear all the data transferring, both digital and analog, and everything is just moving. And meanwhile, there are what I ended up calling God bots, these little like semi-autonomous agents that are running around through all of these endless streams of endless information and data, and they're reorganizing and changing the flows of information. And it was a really overwhelming experience. I mean, it was just so much data, so much information at once. But what I came out of that with was, all right, things on the front side of reality are looking very, very challenging right now, whether we want to identify it as Trump, or this was before coronavirus, but we can add in coronavirus, climate change, natural disasters, wars, politics, religion, all the rest of it, everything that is really coming to the surface right now, and where we see such divisiveness and so much conflict and so much struggle, and just the rhetoric just keeps going up and up and up and up and up. You know, it's like Trump can he be more misogynist? Can he be more racist? Can he be more white nationalist? I don't know. I mean, he keeps raising the bar for himself. But the overall feeling was, you know, kind of like when you have a powerful psychedelic experience, you need to go through, well, you don't need to. This is the thing. It's actually a choice. If you choose to allow it, your entire sense of self will disintegrate. And parts of the self, for many people, they're going to be reaching out and clinging on to the wait. No, I don't want to dissolve. I don't want to dissolve. I want to hold on to whatever it is. But if you can do that, that then allows the universal self to arise into consciousness at that point. And in a sense I feel that that's what we're going through, if we look at all of society as what I would call a meta ego, patterns of thought, patterns of behavior, patterns of action, patterns of belief, then what we're going through is kind of a collective ego death in a sense. And it's very messy right now. It's very traumatic right now. And there are parts of that meta ego that are really, really holding on tightly, that don't want to let go and wants to preserve the status quo. But the reality is, we cannot continue with business as usual. We have passed the point where that is viable and feasible as a species any longer. So it feels like there is a cracking open, which is difficult to pass through. But this is the passage through which we actually have the opportunity to create something profoundly new and profoundly more harmonious, that both recognizes our individual value and then also recognizes the ultimate interconnection of all beings and all things, that it's really all one self interacting with itself, and it's time for us to take responsibility for that. That a term I use a lot is that humans tend to behave as God toddlers. So we are God in human form. We're not taking responsibility for that. We're like little toddlers. We go, yeah, you did that, and I'm there, you know. It's time to grow up. And that's what I said, this is part of the growing up process.
Wow. Beautiful, brother. Thank you. You know, it's like I'm reminded in the way that you said that we are the individual as well as we are the all as consciousness. And it's like a chess player has to subdivide themselves and imagine themselves to be all these different pieces, with another player who's imagining himself to subdivide themselves into all these pieces, so that you can have this dimensional battle warfare. But at the end of the day, you can put it away. So having that meta disposition, right, at the same time, that unity consciousness, is like the word team is plural and singular.
Yeah.
The word, and so we can be plural and singular, like team, every individual and the all. And we don't have to have a fight with it and the beauty of these beautiful medicines is they reveal to us these deep truths that can't come from rational thinking. Can you share about how that happens, like why that happens?
Yeah, it's because, you know, the word that I've already brought up is that there are all these paradoxes, and that the rational mind wants things to either be this or that. It's either yes or it's no. It fits in this category or it fits into that category. And, you know, that's a fundamental way through which the mind generates meaning in order to identify, well, this, because this is that, this means something. And that feeds our sense of understanding, which is really innate to human beings. We want to understand things. And when we don't understand things, we have a propensity to make things up and then go around behaving as though the things that we made up are the things that are true. So we're sort of addicted to meaning in a sense. And that we don't want things to be paradoxical, because when things are paradoxical, then they don't neatly fit into this or that category. That how can something both be and not be at the same time? How can I be, I'm either an individual or I'm God. How can I be both at the same time? And the ego can run with that in any direction. And this is just how the egoic mind works. And if we were to talk about the reason, it works that way for precisely the analogy that you just brought up. So there's this one universal consciousness that's interacting with itself. Now, if it is always fully aware that it's always interacting with itself, you cannot play a good game of chess. For example, if you sit down just by yourself and you put out the chessboard, because I used to do this when I was a kid, that I would try and okay, I'm really going to commit to playing one side. But then, see, you always know what the other side's going to move. So then there's no satisfaction in that. That to get satisfaction out of a game of chess, you need to play against another.
Yes.
And so God, the universal intelligence, in order to satisfy its own sense of enjoying itself in the largest sense, it has to evolve itself into sufficiently capable forms that can become self-aware, but also are thoroughly convinced by the illusion of separateness, so that it is thoroughly invested in the reality of its individual nature. And that's what makes the game satisfying, right? Okay, because again, there's this infinite universal consciousness that has no beginning and has no end. And what else is it gonna do? Well, it's gonna play a game with itself. But in order to make the game satisfying, it has to really believe it. Just in the same sense that when we go watch a movie, you don't want to be sitting there watching a movie and saying, oh man, I just see that person acting. I don't believe any of this. And you look at all the plot holes and you pick it all apart. Now you want to go to a movie where it's just I was totally engrossed in that film and it made me feel something. And I cried and I laughed and I really felt when that character died. Well, this is God's movie. That's what is going on. So we have to be sufficiently intelligent enough to be aware that we're here, but not super intelligent so that we're actually invested in the illusion of separateness that allows for the game to continue. But we also come with a built-in escape valve, that we have the potential, each one of us, whether it's through psychedelics or through meditation or through martial arts or through tantra or whatever the person's path is, that opens up their energetic system, that gets them beyond the patterns of the ego, that we all have access to universal consciousness. It's our birthright as human beings, but it's hidden from us most of the time, because then we would never do anything, because then we wouldn't be invested in the duality of experience. Like right now, I'm feeling a little bit thirsty. And so my water is over here. So I've got to dualistically think, well, actually I'm separate from the water, and by drinking the water, I will quench my thirst. As an animal, that's necessary. So it's this profound game. And so cheers to that.
Cheers, brother. Cheers to everyone.
Yeah, so I can keep riffing if you want, but I didn't quite answer your question, but I don't want to dominate the conversation.
Well, I'm just drinking up what you're saying in bliss. So please, what's there in the life for you? Please do share.
Yeah, so when we're talking about psychedelics and how and why they work the way that we do, that we actually had a briefer conversation a little bit earlier today, and that in many ways, psychedelic molecules function as neurotransmitters within the human system. And of course, our everyday egoic sense of consciousness is facilitated through our neurotransmitters. If we were to remove all the neurotransmitters from our body, there'd be no action, right? You know,
Yes.
sometimes people get like, oh, you're reducing it to like chemicals. That's so reductionistic. You're reducing it to molecules. And one of my responses to that is, what the fuck is a molecule? I mean, really, just because we've labeled it, it's like we don't, it doesn't mean we understand what it
It's just a
is.
potentiality.
Yeah, that really, so we're talking about these patterned packets of energy that coalesce together into different forms. And so our whole perception of reality is always mediated by chemical compounds, whether we are meditating, whether we are talking on Zoom, whether we are watching Netflix, whether we're going for a hike in the forest. It doesn't matter what we're doing. Our consciousness and awareness is always mediated by molecules and chemical compounds within our system. And the same thing when we fall in love with someone, you know, we get the release of endorphins within our body, you know, and that's not to say that love is just a chemical experience, because it's much richer and more than that, but it's mediated through the chemical compounds, right? It's just our natural biology. So I take a very naturalistic approach to all of this. Now with psychedelics, what we're getting, now there are different categories of psychedelics. There are, the two most common are tryptamines and phenethylamines. And then there are others that really, they're more bordering on neurotoxins. So they're not quite as popular, you know, like scopolamines. But in the family of tryptamines, we have things like psilocybin mushrooms. That's formed by the tryptamine base molecule. We have ayahuasca, which is generally made with NN-DMT, which also is the base molecule, is the base tryptamine molecule. And then we have things like 5-MeO-DMT, and then there's a number of purely synthetic tryptamines like 4-ACO-DMT, 5-MeO-MIPT, DIPT, right? List goes on and on and on. But what we have is a basic structure of a molecule. And you know, we were looking earlier in Rick Strassman's book, and so we had the basic tryptamine molecule, and if you put a little oxygen atom at just the right place on the tryptamine molecule, that makes serotonin. And serotonin is one of our basic everyday neurotransmitters. Now you can take that same molecule and you change it a little bit more, and it turns into melatonin. So then that's the neurotransmitter that our body releases when it says, hey, it's time to go to sleep now. You're not going to be paying attention to the outside world, 3D world anymore. Now we're going into dreamland. That's facilitated by a neurotransmitter. So then you can just take this basic building block. Like when I was a kid, I was way into Legos. So I kind of think of it in terms of Legos. Like you have your basic Lego structure, and you can put another piece here, or you can take that one off and put another piece over here. And that's what we're getting at the molecular level. And so serotonin is almost DMT, which is almost psilocybin, which is almost 5-MeO-DMT. So they're all very closely related. They're all in the same tryptamine family. But what happens when we ingest these things is that it disrupts our normal egoic patterns. And in the ultimate sense, I reduce everything to energy. Everything is energy. The ego is merely a collection of patterns of energy, which collectively create our sense of self as a character. So in other words, it's our body postures, our body language, our tone of voice, what gestures we use, our facial expressions, right? All of these things taken together, these are just expressions of energy because they're patterns. In other words, people aren't completely different from one day to the next, that we recognize people. It's like, oh yeah, this person is, and you can even take a really good actor who can do impressions, right? Where they can really take on the appearance and mannerisms of somebody else, right? And it just shows like we're all just characters, right?
Yeah.
Now, those characters are running off of our normal neurotransmitters. So when we ingest a psychedelic, what happens is that those patterns of thought, belief, expression, and embodiment, they all get disrupted in a sense, so that it allows for some patterns that are really rigid, it allows them to loosen up. And at really high levels, it actually breaks apart these patterns completely so that we move beyond our egoic identification. And in a psychedelic experience, this is generally referred to as an ego death. Because when these events happen, the ego is 100% convinced it's dying. And not just the ego, but the body, right? People are like, oh my God, I'm dying. Ah. And it's because there's this energetic expansion that's taking place, that we are changing our energetic carrying capacity. And if the person can choose to let go in that experience, which there's no mandate, there's no requirement, you do not need to let go. Really sucks if you're going through this and you don't let go. It becomes traumatic. But if you can choose to let go, then your awareness extends beyond the confines of the ego. And then you're able to enter into awareness of universal consciousness. And it is not in any way, shape, or form created by the psychedelic compound. All that it does, the psychedelic compound disrupts the ego so that our fundamental nature can be experienced because it's already there. So it reveals our fundamental nature. It doesn't create it in any sense.
Wow.
So it's a removing of the artificial barriers that we've created that allow us to function as individuals. And I always like to say, when talking about these kinds of things, it's important that we not look at the ego as the bad guy and say, oh, so the ego is bad, so you've got to get rid of the ego. You've got to kill the ego, that it's the ego that's making everything wrong. No, the ego is what allows us to function as the very sophisticated social animals that we are. And so it's a wonderful gift. And it's also through the ego that God gets to play all these different characters, which is lots of fun. Okay, so the ego is a good thing. The problem is that the ego is just limited in its identification. We become identified with the identity of the ego, and we live through that. And so being able to have a transcendent experience where you can just bask in the infinite nature of being outside of the confines of who it is that we think that we are and have been playing ourselves as for our whole lives, that is profoundly transformative and profoundly healing. And that's where the greatest potential of psychedelic experience lies, as far as I'm concerned. But it's simply a shift in energy. If we just get down to the bare nuts and bolts of it, it's that these different neurotransmitter molecules allow us to perceive and experience in a heightened energetic state our true nature beyond the regular confines of the ego, which are just patterns of energy. So we're just transcending beyond those patterns and just revealing what already is.
Beautiful. Beautiful. Thank you. Brother, can you share with us some of your favorite cocktails of medicines? And perhaps, what type of experience they led you into?
Yeah, well, I've already shared a little bit of that.
So what was the first set? The first set you said you did a combination of?
Well, over the past few years, okay, so well, here, let me give you some history.
Yes.
And then we can kind of get into the idea of cocktails. Started off as a high school student. I got drunk and I threw up, and then I felt terrible for the next few days. And I just, when I was drunk, I felt like I was sloppy and stupid. And then I just felt terrible. And so that happened to me once. And I was like, I'm not interested in that at all. This is not my kind of experience. And then I got to try cannabis. I think I was probably 15 years old. And for me, that was, oh, I want to listen to music. I want to go out and walk in nature. I want to watch the sunset. I want to be absorbed in what I'm feeling and experiencing. And so I learned, as a teenager, that I just didn't have any interest at all in alcohol, but I was very interested in cannabis. I was very interested in marijuana because I was able to channel that then into creating music and drawing and writing poetry and also enjoying nature and listening to music. And I found that, I could smoke some cannabis, and if I watched a movie, I was all that much more into the movie. It's like, wow, this is great. So I consider cannabis to be a low level psychedelic. That also, in my opinion, some people are very, very straight, like don't mix medicines. But I find that cannabis goes with pretty much any other psychedelic I've ever tried. I find that they go very well together, particularly in the late, like if you're working with a longer acting psychedelic compound, particularly later on in the experience, when you feel like, oh, for example, I first discovered this with psilocybin mushrooms. You're on your way down, you think, okay, the psilocybin experience is ending. Actually, you take a couple hits of cannabis and all of a sudden, boom, it opens back up again. And then you get a couple more hours. And so I found that, they really go well together. So I started with cannabis. Then in college, as a philosophy major, everybody kept telling me, it was like, well, if you're a philosophy major, you've got to try magic mushrooms. So I eventually ended up getting to try magic mushrooms. And my first experience with that, I was really unsure about it. It's like, well, everything's just kind of weird, and I'm not quite sure what to make of it. And actually, in that very first experience, I was at a music festival, and I was walking around. I got separated from my friends, and I was walking around, and I felt like I could see inside everybody's heart, in the sense of like what's really going on with each person. And that was really kind of uncanny for me. So it was like, okay, maybe I shouldn't look at people because this is like too much. It's like, in other words, I was seeing both the character that they were portraying through their ego, and then also seeing, well, this is the genuine energy of what's really going on inside them. And most often these are not the same things, that people are wearing a mask. People are projecting a certain sense of self. They're not actually being authentic. So that was kind of unnerving for me. But then I got comfortable with psilocybin mushrooms. And then many years later, ended up discovering Salvia divinorum and ended up doing a lot of work with Salvia divinorum. But I always took things like one at a time. Like with psilocybin mushrooms, my approach was never take any cannabis until the very end, because as soon as you take cannabis, it's going to influence whatever happens within the experience. And so for many years, I was kind of a purist about it, right? It was like, no, I want to just experience what the mushrooms are going to give me, because what I found with mushrooms was that it's incredibly variable. That say something is kind of difficult within your experience. Well, all you need to do is refocus on something else, and then you're out of whatever it was you were in, and you're into something else. And so I felt that there was this malleability to it. But as soon as you take any cannabis, that would follow you through all the way.
That's right.
So I was kind of purist about it. Then I got introduced to 5-MeO DMT, which is just the top of the line. I mean, that for me, that is the ultimate psychedelic compound. And then after that, got introduced to DMT, and then also peyote and ayahuasca. And it's interesting, here in Ashland, we have the Santo Daime Church. So I was going to the Santo Daime Church and drinking ayahuasca with them. And they are like hardcore, don't ever mix medicines is their message. And even to the point where a lot of people who go to the Daime Church, they won't take any other psychedelics. They're just like, no, Daime is my medicine. But, I wasn't a member of the church. I was a visitor there. And then I got into, for 7 years, I did one-on-one sessions with clients with 5-MeO DMT. And I was doing that like 3 to 5 times a week. I was taking the medicine with all my clients. And then I eventually retired from that. And that's when I really started mixing different cocktails in a
Yeah.
sense. Um, and that was just purely for myself, you know, that I had been through my own process of reformatting and energetically opening and transforming. And then I used what I learned from that to work with others to help them through that process. And then when I essentially retired from that, it was like, oh, well, now I have more of a playtime.
Yes.
And so at that point, that's when I got more interested in MDMA and MDA, but then almost always would mix that with also, so different varieties of 5-MeO MIPT or 4-ACO DMT or psilocybin, always also mixing it with cannabis. And keep in mind, it's not like all at once, that often I would stagger it through
Yeah.
the night. It's like, and then, okay, now I'm ready to mix in a little methoxylated ketamine or MXE. And then maybe finish it off with some cannabis. But really, I find that in terms of mixing, one of the things about starting with a base with MDMA or MDA is that it's very ecstatic and very pleasant. Not for everyone. Some people just find it kind of edgy and they're not comfortable. But for me, it's just like this, yes. You know, there's just a deep yes with that. And then when you mix in other things, it allows really sort of an ease into it. You know, like mushrooms can be edgy. You know, there could be some dark, edgy, heavy stuff that happens. But you know, so having a base of MDMA or MDA can make it a bit more pleasant in some ways and easier to move through. And then, you know, I've also combined that with 5-MeO DMT and also DMT. So I guess I don't really have like a favorite cocktail, but I do think it's, you know, for anyone of a psychonautical bent, which I guess I have to admit that, you know, I do fit into that category, that I'm very interested in the transformative potential of psychedelics, the therapeutic potential, the healing potential. And I also just, you know, if I'm honest, I'm just absolutely fascinated by them. And
Yes.
that I'm interested in them also just for the experience of whatever it is that they have to present, you
Yeah.
know. So I'm the kind of person where if somebody brings me something new, they're like, hey, you want to try this? My answer is generally, yeah, I'm really curious. What does this one do? What does that one do? But what's really, from, you know, my perspective, what's fun, what's amazing is that when you combine them, that you get energetic presentations that you don't get from just one or the other. And so you get, I mean, each one is already novel. And it's
Yeah.
like you're combining several different kinds of novelty, and then it becomes even more novel. And for me, that's just fascinating. It's just absolutely fascinating. And that even the same combinations can produce completely different results. I mean, it always boggles my mind that sometimes in the visionary states that I go into, it's more like dreaming in the sense where everything, I'm clearly in a visionary state, but everything is just incredibly realistic. You know, like I might see Satyen, and then there you are, and you look exactly like you, even though I'm really deep in the psychedelic experience. And then there's other times where there are beings playing with each other that are just made out of abstract geometry.
Yes.
And it's like, but this is the same combination of stuff I took, you know, a few weeks ago, and it's totally different. And that for me is just part of the fascination of. So this is where, you know, when we're dealing with psychedelic states, I myself, I do not look at things in terms of quote unquote alternate realms or multiple dimensions. That's not the way I look at it. That for me, that just the overarching term that I use is the divine imagination. That we're moving beyond, because, you know, people say, well, I must have been in another realm because there's no way I could imagine that. And my response to that is, Well, that's only true from your ego perspective. Your ego couldn't have imagined that. But you see, you're not actually your ego. That's just an aspect of who you are. You are the divine consciousness. And from that level, you can imagine anything that is possible. And that's what you're interacting with within these realms, is you're interacting with different levels of yourself. And there is an infinite variety of experience to be had within that. Some of it is very personal, some of it is archetypal, some of it is transpersonal, and some of it is universal, right? So there's multiple different layers that you can move through, even just in one experience.
Can you weave those out again? Just those last few.
Yeah, so we have personal content. So for example, you take a psychedelic and let's say you were traumatized as a child, and then you might re-experience part of that trauma, or maybe view the experience through somebody else's eyes, and that might help resolve some of that trauma for you. So there can be a lot of personal content that comes up in a psychedelic experience. So that's the personal level.
Yes.
But then there can also be the archetypal level, where here you're not necessarily dealing with your own personal stuff, but so just put it into just a random context. Maybe you're experiencing the divine energetic interplay between the divine masculine and the divine feminine.
Yeah.
And then maybe you relate that to your own personal relationships, but you're experiencing it at a more universal level. Like, for example, I've talked to people who said, well, I was tripping with my lover, and then I was looking at him or looking at her, and she cycled through thousands of different women. And then she told me that she was looking at me, and I cycled through thousands of different men. And for each one, there was a different either attraction or a different repulsion that was taking place, right? So that's where I would say, well, that's more of an archetypal level. Versus, you can take a psychedelic and you can look at your loved one and like, I really see you. I love you, right? And it's very, very personal. But here we're cycling through different projections, different archetypes. So that's more of an archetypal level. And then there's the transpersonal level, where you might feel, for example, something that people describe is separation from God, right? Feeling separate, feeling alone, which might be personal, but then it could also be, like I had this experience once myself. This was on 5-MeO DMT, where I was feeling identified with the universal consciousness, but then I could feel all of these sense of individuals who felt disconnected, that they felt alone and isolated, right? So that's not Martin material, right? That's what I mean. It's more transpersonal, that it's not about me, it's not about my experience, but I'm feeling something that's kind of more in the field of humanity within itself, okay?
Yes.
So that's the transpersonal level. And it's not playing out through an archetype such as the divine masculine or the divine feminine. It's more of it's a feeling of an energy that is not necessarily related to my personal self, but has some place within reality.
Yes.
Okay. And then there is the universal level, or the absolute level. And that is where, so in these in-between states, the personal, it's really closely related to the individual. The archetypal, it's related to the individual in terms of what kind of experiences they're processing through themselves in relation to subject, object, and subcapacity, and also the transpersonal. And within those three realms, there's an endless, infinite variety of things that may happen. Just like your personal life history is different than my personal life history. So if you're having a psychedelic experience about your personal life, it's going to be different than me experiencing something about my personal life. Now, you may have an experience of the divine masculine and the divine feminine, but it's going to play through your experience in some way that relates to you, that you can relate to and you can understand. And if I have that experience, it's going to be a bit different because it's going to be related to me. be related to my perspective in some capacity. Okay, and then in the transpersonal, it's like, wow, there's like geometry, fractals. I mean, it gets, it's still somewhat kind of universal that people see and experience similar things, right? It's not personal, but it's still going to show up in a way that's unique for each individual and what they're able to process and perceive and conceptualize in that moment, in that time. So within these realms, these low, I guess we could call them these lower realms, there's a lot of room for variety. There's a lot of room for unique experiences to arise. But where that dissolves is in the complete non-dual experience of sense of transcending beyond the apparent reality of subject and object into universal consciousness, where from the individual perspective, it becomes, I am God. I am that. I am it. This is it. It is me. I am that. It is in there. Anybody who has that experience, it's identical to anybody else who has that experience. In my take on it, and you know, having worked with enough people and having discussed this enough, that I'm very confident in saying that if you have a full non-dual experience, it will be identical to anybody else's non-dual experience because it's revealing the universal nature of the self. See, it's universal. It's not my experience. It's not your experience. It's the experience. It's the experience of being. And that is, we all have a natural birthright to experience that for ourselves. And then, and it's also at that level, because it embraces all the paradoxes and it embraces the individual versus the universal and all of that, that when you have that experience, it forms the basis of a sense of knowing that comes from the experience, but it in and of itself is not a thing that you know, because everything that we know resides here in the realm of duality. Because the glass of water is a thing. I know the thing of the glass of water. But the universal sense of being, that's not a thing because it has potential for all things and resolving of all paradoxes and all contradictions within it. So it's just, I like to liken it to when you love someone, you know it because you feel it. It's just, why do I love you? I don't know. I do, and I know it because I feel it. And this is the same thing where you just feel, it's not just, and there's lower levels of this where people say, well, I felt connected to everything. And my take on that is, well, that's still residing within the realm of duality because you're saying, I feel connected to everything. So that's getting closer to the truth. But when you get all the way, it's no, I am everything.
Yes.
And I'm not talking about the individual. And it's not that Martin is everything. Martin is just Martin. But what makes Martin Martin is also what makes everything else everything else. And so you can't think your way into that experience. You can't believe your way into that experience. You can't learn your way into that experience. The only way into that experience is to let go of everything. And then it arises spontaneously because that's just what there is.
Yeah.
And it's just there. And it's the same for everyone. Everyone who has it, then you could tell, right? You talk to someone and beforehand you tell them about it and they're like, well, I guess I kind of get what you're talking about, or I don't know. Well, I believe that, but I don't know. But then when someone has had the experience, you can say, hey, have you experienced yourself as God? And they're like, yeah. And you know that's true? Yeah, I know that's true because I've had the experience. And then it forms a basis for your understanding, but it's not an object of knowledge. It's not an object of belief. And this is also why I say that, look, spiritualities, they can be more or less helpful in getting people to this place, but it's not about any particular form of spiritual practice. It's not about any particular religious belief. It's not about having the right set of ideas. It's not about having the right behaviors or practices. That all of that is kind of irrelevant. That it's about, are you willing to surrender everything that you think that you know and let go and maintain awareness, because people can also blank out where they don't maintain awareness, but actually maintain your awareness, which takes a lot of courage, as everything opens up to infinity, and then recognize it as yourself. And then have the integrity to come back into the individual that you are and bring that back and say, okay, so my only job is to be myself. And can I do that with integrity and authenticity, and maybe do it with a little style and a sense of humor too?
Oh, brother, thank you so much. I'm just like blown wide open over here. Friends, family, there's so much richness in this share. I'm really, like, you can feel it. Like, I'm vibrating here. We're all vibrating here. Please go through this again. There's much great wisdom, insight, and an invitation, to be the fullness of who we are here and everywhere. Brother, any last, how can our friends get in touch with you and find out what you do and what you have going on?
Yeah. Thanks for asking. Well, as the multifaceted individual that I am, my main webpage is just martinball.net. As you know, I'm an author, I'm an artist, I'm a musician. I do a lot of different things. So that's my main webpage. For people who are having difficulty integrating either their psychedelic experience or their non-dual experiences, because it can be difficult to integrate, I also offer that as a service, and I have a web page for that. It's called non-dual-entheogenic-integration.com, and I offer one-on-one sessions with people. As an artist, if people want to check out my art, they can go to fractalimagination.com, and that's where my art galleries are.
Incredible. You have to take a look at that.
Oh, thank you.
Take a look at that.
And for music, martinball.bandcamp.com is where I have my music. My podcast is The Entheogenic Evolution. You can find it on iTunes or wherever podcasts are available. You are there on my podcast, along with many other fascinating individuals. And of course, on Facebook, you can find me at Martin W. Ball on Facebook. But I'm almost at the 5,000 person limit, so I don't accept many new friend requests these days, because I like to leave that open for people. But come by my webpage and, or my Facebook page and say hello if you want to. But I'm always happy to, help out with people in any way that I can. That, this is a process that I've been through myself, and really having gone through this, that's been my mission, is to not only help other people with this process, but also just to spread the word, this is reality, and help people find the courage and integrity to embrace it themselves, so that we can all be who we're meant to be. And as to kind of bring it back to where we first started, to help birth us into the reality that really honors and recognizes both the universal nature of ourselves, that we are all one, and we are all also the individuals. And so that love and attention needs to be paid to each one of us. And it starts with us loving ourselves.
Thank you so much, brother.
Yeah, thank you for the opportunity. This has been really excellent, Satyen.
Yeah,
really enjoyed it.
Amazing, brother. Okay, I look forward to having you come back again in our next chat. All right, much love, everyone. Thanks so much.